And we also have Nibiru here. I think this might actually start declining now because, for example, Kashchira, there are a lot of times ending on just, a Rise Hard Pass with some sets, just under 5 summons.
Nibiru is in my opinion, probably the most interesting card to look at in this format. I think it's really, really interesting. Interesting typically is a good thing, but in the case of Nibiru, it can also feel a little bit... It feels a little bit like gambling. You know what I mean? Nibiru, in this current format, I think is a solid card, but you're never sure whether your opponents are going to play around it or not. And this applies to both sides. It applies to both sides. It applies to the people playing Nibiru against Kashchira, and it applies to Kashchira players thinking whether they need to play around Nibiru in the current format, right? Because if you think no one's playing Nibiru, you can just play into it and ignore it. But I think from recent results, I think Nibiru has to be respected. Simply because currently people are still playing it. From the deck profiles that I've been seeing the last 2 weeks that we've reacted to on stream, I want to say the majority of people have still been on Nibiru. I'm pretty sure. And I also think that a lot of people underestimate, like, Nibiru. When you put Nibiru into your deck, you're not always looking at the situation as, like, you're not always going second and you're not always facing Kashchira, right? There's other matchups, and there's also the matchups where you go first, and Nibiru is like a really, really solid backup to any board in this format. Because the decks that can play around Nibiru typically can only play around Nibiru when they go first and they have like free range of decisions and full combos, right? When I go first and I set up some sort of board, it is almost impossible for any deck to play around Nibiru, right? If I just have one interaction against the Kashchira monster, suddenly there is no way anymore to get to a Rysart without 5 summons. Because you need to put 3 level 7s onto the field and then summon a Rysart. So if I remove one of your level 7s, that always has to be the 5th summon if you still want to get there. If you're playing Sprite and I'm preventing your Gigantic Sprite, or your red to hit the field, or you need to use your red to negate one of my cards or whatever, you're never able to prevent that Nibiru. So I think Nibiru has a spot in this metagame, despite it not always being consistent when you go second, right? Sometimes it doesn't work when you go second. You have to accept that. But I think Nib is it is a high risk, high reward type of card, but there's also a certain scenarios where it's not like, yeah, right? Like, I think it's... And there's also a point to be made. Like, I think a couple decks are in a very specific situation where, for example, different Naturia variants. Different Naturia variants have the benefit where you could argue that if my opponent plays around Nibiru by going for a Rise Hard Pass, your deck inherently has a much higher win rate in the matchup, right? Like, Runic decks, by default, can probably beat a Rise Hard Pass, depending on what the back row is, right? Depending on what the back row is, those decks have definitely a chance, right? It's not like full zone lock, 0% win rate. It's like you have a chance there, even with a dead Nibiru in hand, maybe. And so I think those are factors that make Nibiru better than just this black and white thinking of like, hey, if they play around it, it's dead, so I don't want to risk that. And I think that contributes to the card still seeing play. And I think that's why it's still an A-tier card overall here on this thing. It is declining a little bit, but I don't think we will see the card completely vanish from the format. I think it's still such a... in people's minds, the Kashchira combo, the Kashchira zone lock is so prevalent, even though the chance that they even open that combo isn't like terribly high. It's not low either, but it's like, they don't always have it. But in people's minds, it's always like a feel-good thing to have this card in your deck that is like, if they go for the combo, I have it, right? I win the game. Simple as that. And I think that's why the card is here.